I'm happy to say I'm here today with Colin Evans, and Colin would like to set the record straight on some of the things he was referred to in one of Hans Siddig's interviews, and Hans mentioned Colin as well as Phil Hartlebury and a few other people, and Colin would like to just correct some of the historical errors that were put forward in that interview. And as such, Colin, I'm happy to have you here and happy to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Hi, John. Yes, thanks for allowing me the platform just to correct a few things that have been said about myself and Phil Hartlebury and also Jeff Price over the years. There's been a number of things said that are not accurate. Yeah, it's nice to be able to correct them. So let me kind of start with my basic history. That I was born in Salisbury, went to Marlborough High School, and moved around a bit because my dad was a civil servant. So we were in Livingston and Dola, Blantyre as a child. And then I ended up at Ellis Robbins and then joined the police force. So that happened in 1974. I was actually Squad 6, which coincidentally we were in the depot at the same time as Haygarth Long, which you've interviewed before. So Garth and Sterling were Squad 5 and I was Squad 6, so we were together there. Then when I left depot, I went straight to investigation department in Salisbury Central. Stayed there for about a year or so and then moved to Salisbury Park doing ground coverage. The only sort of really interesting thing there at Salisbury Park was a source got hold of me one afternoon at about 4 o'clock and said he'd seen armed men in the farming area, which, to be honest, we didn't really believe. So we took him. Well, I took him. I was alone. Took him down and went to have a look. And sure enough, there were 4 or 5 AK welding characters in the forest. I only had a P1, which I loosed off a few shots, and fortunately they ran. And we did a sweep of the area after that and found some AKs and established that it was a Zipra group that had come up through the Mondoro TTL, and they'd held a farmer and his wife and robbed them about 5 days earlier. The group was accounted for in the townships. They gapped it into the townships, didn't really do any damage, and they were accounted for. And I think it was in one of those actions that one of the reaction force, Andy Smith, Section Officer Andy Smith, was killed in Glenora, which was rather unfortunate. From ground coverage, I went into Special Branch and worked Motoko, Marawa, Mondoro, Chinamora, Seki. Primarily with what had been established then was the SIS sticks, who were a combat reaction force. It had obviously been seen how effective scouts were and how effective having your own reaction team was, and sort of the likes of Vic Opperman and Ken Stewart and them had created this little operational teams, and there were a few operational teams, and the one that I mainly worked with was Roy Bennett in Chinamora and in Mondoro. I also worked with Pachedu in the Borrowdale house. We had a couple of ex-SAS guys there, like Jake Harper Ronald and the late Ian Supple. And then came 1979, and obviously the Special Branch realized that Muzarawa was not going to win the election. So a couple of little units were formed to do operations to try and disrupt ZANU and ZAPU's election progress and try and reduce the votes and maybe even eliminate some of the candidates. So we worked with Pachedu on that. And those are obviously operations that were probably not quite legal. So we won't dwell on those. Then at the end of the war, I got recruited to work with SADF. which pretty much started almost immediately because we'd had a lot of contact with the South Africans. They were funding our operations in the last year of the war, the covert ops. And then, contrary to Hans's statements, Phil and I were actually arrested in 1980, December 1980, New Year's Eve. So that much is correct. But we didn't serve 20, 25 years. There was no intervention by Nelson Mandela. Phil and I were released in 1986 after we were acquitted. So we were arrested. We were taken to the Goromonzi detention center, along with Jake Harper Ronald, who was also arrested. And we were there for some months undergoing spirited interrogation and solitary confinement. We were released in 1986 as a result of being acquitted and then a detention without trial, period. So where Hans says we were only released in, I don't know what he said it was.
20 years later.
Yeah, 25 years later. That's actually totally and absolutely incorrect. We were released in 1986 when Mandela was still in jail, and certainly no South African peace process had started or discussion. I think he's taken Kevin Woods and Philip Kunjwayo and Mike Smith's situation, and he's put us there for some reason. So there's a couple of other things here in that after our arrest, when Phil and I were arrested, and the book started to come out by the Rhodesians in the 80s. The explosion at 88 Manica Road was attributed to us, or certainly that we had supplied the explosives. And some really strange statements were made that we had. So I controlled a covert armory at Braeside, which was part of our trial, where they charged us with the possession of unlawful possession of arms of war. And we had RPGs, a recoilless rifle, AKs, SKSs, all that kind of thing. But we certainly didn't have any explosives. And somebody in one of their books attributed the issue of the explosives as part of 88 Manica Road, which is totally and absolutely incorrect. But I think pressure was on the authorities to arrest somebody, which was why our arrest came shortly after that. And one of the things about 88 Manica Road was that my understanding is that the bomb went off about 30 minutes, 40 minutes after it was supposed to. And yet none of the ZANU Politburo members were in the building. And you got to wonder why not. I mean, you can't have 20 people all late. You can have a couple late, but not 20. So there's a theory that they were tipped off, but that nothing could be done about the bomb itself, because then the source of the information would be revealed. So it was kind of a time when everybody was doing all sorts of different things. And yes, I think the information of the operation was leaked, and I think it was leaked to Danny Stannard. Probably the ZANU PF were pre-warned not to go back, but Stannard didn't want to stop the actual explosion, because then people would know that the intelligence and the operation had been compromised. So that was one of the things that we were wrongfully blamed for. And then the other was obviously the death of the assassination of Joe Kwabi, which we were not part of. The interesting thing with Joe Kwabi was that 6 months before he was assassinated, there was a sort of a dummy run done on him, where a non-explosive box was put under his car wheel, which seemed to be a threat. And everybody thought, well, either he's a non-performing source or they're trying to recruit him and he's not playing ball. So there was definitely an operation against Joe Kwabi. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission came to the opinion that it was the South African CCB of Barnacle, which I think everybody believed. But the interesting thing in that was that the ANC themselves provided a document to the TRC saying that one of their members, Ivan Davids, So an ANC MK guy called Ivan Davids actually admitted to it, to doing the assassination, and he was subsequently executed by the ANC in one of the Angola camps. So we'll never know the truth of that one. But I found it quite interesting that the ANC would produce that sort of evidence to the Truth and Justice Commission. So there was another of the mistruths about Phil and I. Another one that I need to just touch on was that Jeff Price was seen by many to be one of the spies for England, for the UK, which, I mean, there were many named, but no real evidence given. But in Jeff's case, Jeff worked for DCC, the Director of Covert Collection in South Africa. And as such, you have to undergo psychological testing and polygraphs periodically. Now, there's no way that if you're an English agent or an agent for any other foreign country that you're going to pass a polygraph, because that is the main reason is, are you fit for your top secret clearance? And you're certainly not fit if you're working for a foreign power. So that's the emphasis is on that, you know. And Jeff passed every single one of his. So I think you can eliminate Jeff as one of the UK spies. But there certainly were some. There's no doubt because of the compromised operations that we had. I mean, even in the Angolan one the Mozambique ones to kill Mugabe, they were totally compromised, because when the teams got there, the houses were empty. Not even the security guard of the house was there. So there were definitely intelligence compromises. And that sort of leads on to how were Phil and I, and Jake for that matter, arrested. So how did that come about? So Jake's published a book, Sunday Bloody Sunday, and Jake says he wasn't a spy. He was never a spy at that time. Subsequent to his arrest and his torture, he decided that, well, everybody thinks he's a spy, might as well become one. And he started working both for the Americans and for the South Africans. So he was kind of like a triple spy during that period. It's quite interesting that sort of special branch guys, ex-special branch guys who were in CIO, whoever they liaised with, they seemed to become agents for. So Jake was liaising with the Americans, and he became an American spy. Phil and I, how were we arrested? I mean, our trial showed that the state had zero evidence apart from our statements, which were not given freely and voluntarily, obviously. They had zero evidence. So it wasn't because we had done an action that had compromised us or we'd been under surveillance. They had absolutely zero evidence against us apart from our statements. So then you have to analyze, well, where did they get the information from? And there were a couple of thoughts about this. There was a Major Pienaar who was arrested pretty much around the same time we were released, as he tried to flee to Harare, who it appeared had been giving information to the ANC and to the Zimbabweans. But he wouldn't have had the level of information. And if he did, then you got to wonder why Jeff Price wasn't included. You know, I mean, if he had information on me and Phil, he should have had information on Jeff. So you can sort of discount that as an option. And the most credible reason for Phil and I being arrested was that it was a plan by Danny Stannard and Matt McGuinness to kind of cement themselves in their loyalty, to show loyalty to ZANU, really. What we think happened there was that Danny Stannard and Mac, who was the South African Zimbabwe liaison, decided and convinced the military powers that if they were in place, they would have a higher level and a greater broad spectrum of intelligence than just Phil and I had. So if we were sacrificed, they would be given greater sort of ability to collect information, as they would be seen as being loyal. And a whole plan was devised, which included a re-signing of the trade agreement, the offer to release some Angolans and a Russian and some Cubans, and therefore, so therefore, Stannard got us arrested. The South Africans admitted their involvement with us and offered this exchange and this trade agreement. There's actually a statement by Mnangagwa where he says that very early on in our arrests, the South Africans made that admission. However, obviously Phil and I didn't quite play ball because we were denying and we didn't make any admissions. So we were interrogated for, must have been 6 or 7 weeks, and because they were getting nowhere, Danny Stannard he took a personal aspect of Phil's life and made Tony Reid, who was the sort of family liaison, take this document to Brenda, Phil's wife, which subsequently resulted in Phil calling to see Stannard. I mean, it was a personal matter that Stannard decided this was leverage. This is how he was going to get Phil to confess. And it was an action that didn't have to be done. I mean, Phil's sitting there in a solitary confinement. You could just tell him that you'd done it. You didn't have to do it, but Stannard did do it. So Phil wanted to speak to Danny. Danny said yes. South Africans don't want this. They've already agreed to a swap. Zanu's happy with that. Mnangagwa's happy with that. So Phil then gave a full statement, which I was then presented with at some stage, nearly 2 months into our confinement. As it was pointed out to me, both have to be part of this, and I was also told that it was going to be a quiet removal. We would just be quietly deported. So I made a statement, fairly similar to Phil's, but differing in some parts, just in case. And subsequently, we found out that, no, we'd been duped. And we were taken on remand and charged with treason, Official Secrets Act, possession of arms of war. So we went to court. We were acquitted on all counts because there was no evidence. And Judge McNally kind of agreed that 2 months of solitary confinement, some torture and that kind of behavior did not constitute a free and voluntary statement. Then we were redetained and we went for 6 monthly tribunals. So spent prison time, or well, no, detention time with the Air Force guys who were also badly treated and made admissions that were totally false, and was there with Demisa Debengwa and Lookout Masuku.
Were you there with Hugh Slatter?
Yes, he was in a different part of the prison, but I was with John Cox and Neville Weir, but we were all in detention at the same time. Yeah. Oh, there were a couple of guys from Customs as well, and Wally Sutterford, the RF MP, was there earlier on. And then 86, I think, after about 4 or 5 tribunals, they decided that they couldn't really hold us anymore, and what damage can we do after 5 years? And so we were released. We were declared enemies of the state, which results in a sort of forfeiture of all assets. And then we were deported to UK. Didn't spend long there, came back down to South Africa, and Phil went into security, and I carried on with SADF. Only then to be fired by F.W. de Klerk. So, yeah, but I just wanted to kind of place on record that, you know, we weren't there for 20, 25 years. We didn't have anything to do with the 88 Manica Road or Kwabi. All of these things are or stated in books by people who announce them with some authority or speak with authority on your interviews, but they're actually totally and absolutely incorrect. Yeah.
And who was the bodybuilder?
Well, who knows where that came from? I mean, that's another absolute crazy statement. Certainly not me. The only bulk I put on was from drinking beer. Yeah, and also I think it was Hans who said that we were recruited in Germany. Well, we weren't recruited in Germany. We went on a course, an intelligence course with the BND. There was myself and Phil, a guy called Doc Fraser, I think it was, from Bulawayo, and two ZANU guys, or three ZANU guys, and we went to Munich. But an interesting part of that one was that for some reason, Danny Stannard sent Phil and I to London first. The rest of the guys all went straight to Munich. Danny Stannard said he'd arrange an intelligence course with MI6, and he sent Phil and I to London, where no course really took place. We had a couple of discussions over lunch, and that was it. So I've never understood what the purpose or the point of that one was. That I suppose Danny had a plan. I know this is going to be controversial because the Danny Stannard and the Mac McGuinness prior to independence were great guys. And they seemed to be single-mindedly, and they had the same mindset as everybody else had. And everybody's very loyal to both of them. But their behavior and their attitudes after independence were very, very different. And that includes there was a plan to assassinate Mugabe and maybe even Prince Charles, as he was then, at Rufaro Stadium, Independence ceremony or on the route there. Now that was also compromised. And it was compromised by McGuinness, who heard about it or was told about it, and he leaked it to Stannard, and then they prevented the actions from taking place. It's described in Jim Parker's Zulu. He wrote a book about the Zulu Scouts, and he describes that in operation in fairly great detail. But again, personally, I don't think the South Africans would have done such a overt assassination, and certainly it's difficult to believe. And I wonder if it wasn't just another exercise to establish Stannard's credibility within ZANU. I mean, they certainly got great kudos for it. In fact, I think Danny got a medal. But we were sent to a house in Mount Pleasant or Marlborough after that to recover some weapons. And there were a few weapons and a few explosives, but nothing like the amount of stuff that Jim Parker describes in his book. So if it was a real operation, it wasn't a very well thought out one. But to me, it looks more like it was just an exercise to establish credibility. If we go back to the actual SB days where we were working with the SIS stick units that was created by SB, those were, so my function would be to find the intelligence for the SIS units to deploy on. And then once they've deployed, if there's any captures or documents, then you take it from there again. And one of the units that I did work with was in Chinnamora, was with in Mandora was Roy Bennett, but I'm not sure if I mentioned that already, so you need to just check that.
Colin, thank you so much for bringing some clarity. At least you've set the record straight now with regard to those comments that were made about you, which I really appreciate. Thank you very much, sir, for your time, and apologies for any heartache that we may have caused you through our videos.
I mean, John, I understand it's not your job to be a fact checker. The people that come on are supposed to come on voluntarily and give a forthright and true resume of the activities. So it's not your fault that they're incorrect, but thank you for allowing me to just correct a few things there.
Yeah. Great. Appreciate it.